And suddenly your mind expands, and you start looking at the outside world and you start thinking about your place in it and what's happening. This was my moment. And it was really such a troubling event because, I mean, you had these guardsmen lining, which is essentially Mayberry, when the school buses went through where the guard was stationed. The bus driver made us lie on the floor of the bus. These things tend to stick with you, right? And I know this sounds obnoxiously precocious. I mean, really, 10 years old, but it's true. And here's proof. This is actually a political cartoon I drew about the guard in 1970. My mother, bless her, saved it and filed it away, and I discovered it years later. And I actually have political cartoons that are a couple years earlier, because talk about a precocious little shit. Like from 8 years old, I was drawing pictures of Nixon. I know this sounds ridiculous, but my first incarnation as in comics was as a political cartoonist. So I guess it's not surprising. And I can trace a straight line from 1970 and the Kent State Massacre to becoming a journalism major and going into newspapers and political cartoons. So for me, it's, it was a profoundly influential event. And so that's why I've carried this around with me. But more than that, I just thought it'd be a great story. Now, it's important to remember context. 1970, the Vietnam War is a total quagmire. It's ripping the country to pieces. There's protests, millions filling the streets in every city in the country. Every college campus is inflamed. You have massive police reprisals. Does any of this sound familiar? It seems like we're kind of reliving all this right now, which is, what makes this book so relevant. I thought it would be relevant when I started it 5 years ago. I had no idea it would be quite as relevant as it became. And overall was this, specter of the Cold War and the seemingly invincible Soviet Union and nuclear annihilation, just, a press of a button away. But that wasn't my story. I mean, it's important for context, and I do touch on it. But when you start a book, you have to sit down and decide, okay, what's my story about? Well, how am I going to tell this story? Is it going to be about these big sweeping events? Because the Kent State Massacre was the bloody climax of what we call the 60s, this period of 8, 9, 10 years of civil unrest and great societal change. It all came to a head inexplicably on this grassy hillside in Kent, Ohio. But, to make it that sweeping, I think it makes it really impersonal. So I wanted to really boil it down to its most human level. And I decided to focus in on the four kids who were cut down on May 4, 1970. Sandy Scheuer, Bill Schroeder, Allison Krauss, and Jeffrey Miller. 4 remarkable college kids, 4 very typical college kids. And I thought if I told the story through their eyes and their experiences, that would make this it would make this book have a lot of emotional power, because I literally put the reader on the ground with one of these 4 as they move through these 4 days in May when the crisis came to a head in Kent. So you're on the ground with them, and you have all 4, Bill and Sandy and Allison and Jeff. And then I added a 5th, which was the account I stumbled across in an archive of one of the guardsmen, who was also roughly the same age. So a lot of the guardsmen were older, but he was the same age. And it offered the other side, what the guardsmen were going through. So now I have 5 voices, 5 threads, which is kind of a complicated narrative. I mean, I'd never attempted something like that before. Mostly my narrative threads are the perspective of 1 or 2 characters, not 5. And they intertwine and keep moving on. But it really worked out well because one of the 5 was present, at least one of the 5, at every event that happened throughout these 4 days. So I was able to keep that idea, that concept of, the reader being on the ground with somebody. I was able to keep that throughout. And then I had to think about the timeline. And again, I boiled it down. I really just took it down to the lowest level I could and focused on these 4 days in May, leaving out the previous, 8 years, leaving out anything that came after. I just wanted this to be a sharp narrative. So it really starts on April 30th when Nixon goes on the air, national television in prime time, interrupted Tom Jones, and stunned the nation by announcing that US forces had poured over the border of Vietnam into neutral Cambodia. Nixon had promised to wind down the war. He'd announced he was going to withdraw troops. And now suddenly here he is invading another country. The next day, college campuses across the country exploded in outrage. Because remember, and this is the hardest thing for people younger to get their head around. It was hard for me to get my head around. The Vietnam War was not fought by volunteers, as every war has been since. It was over half of the forces in Vietnam were drafted. They were forcibly conscripted. So you had 40 million young draft age men, it was only men then, living in a constant state of anxiety that they were going to get that notice in the mail and be dragged off to die in the jungles of Vietnam. This was the gasoline that absolutely lit the anti-war movement. So in Kent, it starts very quietly. I'll just go over this very, very quickly. Just if you don't know anything about the story, and I think most people really don't, which was an opportunity as a storyteller. I mean, they know something happened. They know some people were shot. They've seen the photo of the woman screaming over Jeff Miller's body. But that's about all they know about it. So it starts very quietly on Kent, just a little rally on the college green, and then tensions start to escalate. And that night there's a big riot in downtown Kent in a bar district called Water Street. A bunch of windows get smashed. The mayor freaks out. The next night, a bunch of students attack the ROTC building on campus. ROTC being the Reserve Officer Training Corps, which is a college program still around that trains junior officers. In the Vietnam era, all these officers went straight to Vietnam after they graduated. So anti-war students felt that ROTC was the physical embodiment of the Pentagon and the war machine right there on their campuses. So a lot of ROTC buildings were attacked. In case of Kent State, they torched it. And it was very spectacular. And at this moment, the National Guard, poured onto campus from 3 different directions and just gassed, beat, bayoneted, arrested any student they found. And you can read the details in the book. It was really just kind of a real overreaction by the point on the part of a Republican governor who was trying to win a primary election, which was being held the next week. So it was all about optics to this guy, pandering to his base, kind of what we're seeing now with, the BLM protests and the Republican governors cracking down on those. And it's the same old formula. It's a really interesting plot structure because, 4 days, but each day has its own climax. And the tensions keep building and building and building with each day. So it's kind of surprisingly suspenseful considering that we know how it's going to end. There's also a lot of quiet moments in the book. And I really love these quiet moments because this is where we get to know the 4 students, and the guardsmen as well. And we learn about how they move through their day and how their relationships are with other people and what their hopes, dreams, fears are. And I find a lot of them just really incredibly poignant, like this episode. This is Sandy Scheuer, and her mom shows up on Sunday afternoon to drop off some clothes that Sandy had wanted. And think about what you're looking at here, because in that second panel, as Mrs. Scheuer hugs her daughter, the next time she'd see her, she'd be lying on a slab in the morgue. So this is the last time she hears her voice, the last time she smells her hair, last time she hugs her. There's some incredibly poignant moments here. Sunday night, a bunch of students march onto the main street next to campus and have a sit down, demand that the military occupation of the campus be ended because they're under curfew. They've got checkpoints everywhere. The guard is harassing everybody. And this right here kind of demonstrates the power of comics because there's very little photo record of what happens at night over these 4 days, just because the photo technology of the day was so rotten. I mean, they're still shooting with film. They didn't have they didn't have high def cell phone cameras. So you had to shoot with film, you had to have a big rig. I mean, it was hard to capture the light. Shooting at night was almost impossible. So you get these really crappy, fuzzy photos since, the first 3 days that all the climax had all taken place at night. But me, with the power of comics, I can conjure up these images on my own, images that don't exist outside of this book. So that was what I brought to this story. And especially in a narrative sense, this has never really existed before. Oh, sorry. What happened was, the guard had a chance to defuse the situation here, and instead they attacked. And it was known as the Night of the Helicopters, and it was brutal. There were like a dozen kids bayoneted badly, beaten, all kinds of stuff went down. You can read it in the book. The nice thing about it gives some really dramatic scenes. You get dramatic lighting. I like drawing night scenes. I think I draw a pretty badass night scene, and they're a lot of fun to draw. So that most of this book takes place at night was kind of cool. And that brings us to Monday, May 4, the deadly day. And again, it starts quietly, and I start, I want you to be able to relate to these kids, and this is the kind of stuff that all of us went through. Bill gets up and puts on his favorite clothes. I even researched the outfits these kids were wearing, and just bustles off to class. I mean, we've all done this. We didn't know that we were, certainly Bill didn't, that he was heading off to his doom. And May 4 comes around, there's a noon rally that was called just to protest the guard on the main college green. And so all of these 5 threads at last, because the guardsmen there as well, all of these 5 threads come together for the first time in one place at the same time. And then the shit hits the fan. Again, the guard attacks. They're being egged on by the governor from the state capitol, who wants to crack down on student protesters. Thinks this is his big opportunity to win his primary election, and so he orders them to attack. The amazing thing about this is that the university was open; it wasn't closed, and so there are 21,000 students on that university, most of whom, 95% of whom are just going back and forth from dorm to class or apartment to class. And the governor didn't give a shit about any of them. Could have cared less. And so he sends the guard into the middle of this campus at noon. If you've ever been on a major university at the noon class break, you know what that's like. Every building on campus empties. And any student who was outside was gassed or attacked. It was crazy. It can best be described as a total clusterfuck. And so the guard just kind of careens around the campus, chasing a few, like 50 protesters and trampling students who get in their way. And then the climactic moment when inexplicably about 12 guardsmen wheel as one and open fire. Shoot down a hill into a parking lot full of about 500-600 students. 4 dead, 9 shot and wounded. 4 of them critically, 2 of them crippled for life. It was a slaughter. And I don't spare the violence here. And that is also, these are also images that have never been seen. I mean, we see photos of the aftermath, because there's a lot of photos from May 4 because it was broad daylight. And the place was crawling with photographers because Kent State had a big photography program. So there were a lot of student photographers. One won a Pulitzer, another one wound up on the cover of Life magazine. I mean, they were just everywhere. And the conditions were optimal. But when the guard opened fire, they very naturally, I think understandably, hit the ground. So during the course of the actual shootings, we don't have those images. Well, comics can conjure those images up based on morgue reports and personal accounts, and, eyewitness accounts, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought it was very important to show these things. I mean, it's kind of like what we're seeing now. Remember during the Black Lives Matter protests when they were really hot and heavy last summer, there was the reactionary rebuttal of Black Lives Splatter. and all of these right wingers saying, well, if we kill a bunch of them, then this thing will end. The same thing was going down in 1970 with the anti-war movement. The, you know, reactionary America, the Archie Bunker types were saying, let's kill 100 of them, and then it'll put an end to this. Well, okay, if you think that, here's what it looks like. Here's what it looks like when a copper jacketed 30 caliber bullet over an inch long goes tearing through a parking lot full of 600 students and through flesh and bone. This is what it looks like. So that's the story, basically. I mean, there's a lot more detail in that, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the research that I did for this story, because I spent a long time researching it, and I feel that I should brag about it a little. I started with interviews, and I always do this, especially with nonfiction books. I really like to get close to the people who were there. And I live, Kent's about, it's maybe 50 minutes away from where I live here in Cleveland. And I know a lot of people down there. I've known them for years because it's a big arts hub. So, you know, I kind of move through that circle. A lot of people up here in Cleveland who went to Kent. So it's amazing how many people that I've touched in my life, you know, run into in my life who were part of this story. It really is kind of remarkable. So I went to them first, and through them and other people, and just started building and building and building. I probably did, 50, 60 interviews with people down there. I specifically focused on people who knew one of the four. I wanted to get close to them, their classmates, their roommates, their friends, try to figure out who these people were. Because again, I'm a complete outsider here. I spent a lot of time in the Kent libraries. The top floor there is something called the May 4 collection, which is this vast archive of material having to do with May 4 that's built up over the years. There's another collection in Yale, which is almost just as big. So it was an unusual problem in that with the other books I've done, say My Friend Dahmer, it was really hard to find any information. You know, you really had, the hunt was to find it at all. With Kent State, the hunt was to dig through this mountain of material and find what I needed. For example, in the May 4 collection, you know, there were boxes and boxes of law enforcement intelligence reports, because this was the age of paranoia, you know, the late 60s, early 1970s. If you've seen like the trial of Chicago 7 or the what's it on HBO Max about Fred Hampton, you'll know just how paranoid the officials were and how the secret war they were conducting against the forces of the radical left, just how far they went, right up to political assassination. So, I mean, just to rifle through this stuff, it's really incredible. The May 4 collection also had a vast photography collection, which is it's really great when you look through it and find little clues. For example, here, this is an anti-war march, fall quarter 1968 or 69, I'm sorry. So just before May 1970, spring quarter. And they're just, you know, the campus of Kent State is at the top of the hill. And here in the bottom, the girl in the front, clapping her hands right above the awl, that's Alison Krauss. That's one of my four. And she was only 18 here. So, I mean, you know, you just find all of this stuff and it's really quite moving. Here's the FBI report on May 4. Again, a lot of this stuff has gone online. That's another big difference between putting this book together and putting together My Friend Dahmer, which, you know, had that same kind of research, which was 10 years ago. Back then, none of it was online. Now, a lot of it's online. Now, it doesn't help a lot because the Kent State report is like 30,000 pages and it's not searchable. So you just kind of got to sit there and go through it bit by bit. Luckily, there's like a synopsis and a table of contents, but still, it's not easy work. But at least I don't have to go to, you know, some archive somewhere. Now, this is the 1970 Kent State Yearbook, which I acquired a copy of. And you have to say, this is pretty much like a yearbook that no other college has ever had before or since. You know, there's Jeff lying in his pool of blood, and there's in the top center, that's the famous photo that won the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, it's really quite a remarkable thing. But these yearbooks, of course, are full of photos. So it was, again, trying to recreate this world. I'm an outsider. I didn't go to Kent State. I wasn't part of this generation. You know, I was coming into it cold. And it's very difficult to make that first step, you know, to try to embed yourself in there and then try to figure out, okay, this is the lay of the land. This is how the campus was put together. This is who the players were. There's a lot. Like I said, I spent the first 2 years just doing nothing but research and interviews. Then I started drawing for another 2 years, but I kept on researching. And I landed a good interview like a week before the book was due and changed some dialogue because of it. So right up to the end, it was really 4 years of research. This is the school paper. I was a college journalist myself, worked for the school paper at Ohio State. So I knew that no one covers a campus and a campus town better than a good college paper. And indeed, that's the case here with the Kent State paper. And I read probably 3 years solid of Kent State editions of this paper, which was published 4 days a week. And it was just a great insight into, you know, this unfolding news event and everything that led up to May 4. Unfortunately, when May 4 happened, university was immediately closed, and so was the paper. So it couldn't function after May 4, which is a damn pity, because they would have covered it very well. But in addition to just the news events, I mean, you know, you look at a paper and in the back, you see the listings, you see what's happening on campus and what's happening in the town, what's happening at the bars, what bands are playing, you know, who's talking. And you get the ads as well, you know, for boutiques and record shops and what have you. And it's just a great window into this very, very small moment in time. And then I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the radical left, because this played a big part in the lead up, at least, to Kent State, to May 4, if not May 4 itself. And the phenomenal paranoia that was coming down from the Nixon administration all the way down to town officials and town policemen. And it's very difficult to penetrate because the radicals I'm talking about here, they were very secretive individuals because they knew they were being hunted. They knew they were being under constant surveillance. And so they masked everything they did. And a lot of them are still that way. They still won't give up their secrets. So it was, and no one was really covering this from the mainstream media. So they just couldn't penetrate this community. So it was really tough to figure out what was going on. And it became kind of a hobby. I'm still doing it just because it's so interesting, and it's never really been put together concisely. And then, you know, like I said, I tried to get as close to them as I could. I found a series of letters that Bill Schroeder wrote to his mom. He wrote his mom every week. This kid was just like a perfect kid. And these wonderful letters, just full of humor and insight, and list what he was doing that week, and, you know, his thoughts. And I mean, he was such a incredible kid. And, you know, you just feel like you can almost climb in their shirt. I mean, that's how close I wanted to get to these guys without having actually known them. That's why the back of the book has 26 pages of footnotes. And I mean, every page, in some cases, every panel is cited with source material. And I did this also with my friend Dahmer. And people seem to really like them. In fact, you know, I've had a lot of people say, you know, I like the footnotes better than the book, which really fucking pisses me off. But I appreciate the compliment. But, you know, read the book. I mean, don't just read the footnote. And then there's visual reference. And, you know, I mean, it's a visual medium. So obviously visual reference is important as any other kind of reference, even though when people read the book, they don't really, I think, understand that this has all been referenced and it's all been researched. Building this campus was really tough. As I said, it's not my campus. So, you know, I really had to try to figure out what it was like at the time. And the thing about colleges and colleges towns is, as most of you know, is the one constant is constant change. And the Kent State campus is rebuilt a couple times. The town is rebuilt a couple times. So how do I get to that point? This is a campus map. It was in the student guide in 1970, and it's pure gold because it has all the buildings, you know, there they are. Has a list of all the buildings. It shows where everything is in position to everything else. So I can use it almost as a reference as I'm composing scenes. You move your characters through the scenes and you know what's in the background, you know what's in the foreground and to the sides. And then, I went and found the photo reference for the individual buildings, some of which are gone. Universities are great about photographing their own buildings because, they're little edifices to whatever, whatever president was working at the time or whatever rich guy donated money to build it. So, I mean, it's not hard to find photo reference for these. One of the tricky things that I realized like halfway through the book and had to do some redrawing was like, I would come across a photo like this is Blanket Hill. This is where the shooting took place. So right here, this weird little structure in the middle, that's called the Pagoda, which was a guerrilla art project put up. It was only supposed to be temporary. It's still there. The dirt patch here is where the guard turned and fired. And they fired down the hill into the parking lot back here. That's where all the students were. They were moving right to left as they're walking to either the campus buildings on the left or to the dorm areas on the right. And most of them were way back here in this road. Most of them were like 400 or 500 feet away. And for some reason, these guardsmen shot into it. But anyways, I'd spent a lot of time here. It's still there. It's a National Historical Site. You can walk it. It's a very moving place to walk around, especially, as you're working on a book like this. But one of the things it came to me when I saw this photo, it's like, oh man, the trees are all smaller because of course it's 50 years ago. So I had drawn the trees too big. So I had to erase a bunch of trees and make them smaller. I mean, it's just these little things that kind of trip you up. Now this was a challenge. This is Water Street. Remember the first day I talked about the Water Street riot? This is Water Street. So it's just a grungy bar district, a lot of fun. But I had a lot of trouble finding photo reference for this. And I spent a long time putting this setting, again, it's almost like a film set, putting this together. Now the top photo is the only period photo I found of that strip. And it's fuzzy. I couldn't really see what was going on. I got the basic shapes of the building. The bottom photo is actually what it looks like now. So you see half the buildings are gone. Something happened to the roof of the big building in the middle. I'm not sure what's going on there. So I just kept looking and looking and looking. I was having a lot of trouble. I was able to figure out what was on the street by using street guides. And this is just basic journalism techniques, So I went to the 1970 street guide. There's all the addresses. You have both sides of the street. And so I could piece it together. I did that with a schematic. And I just started filling in the blanks. I went down to Kent and would stand in front of one of the buildings that still existed, look directly across the street and line up another building with the address, because addresses don't always line up perfectly. Figured out where everything was. I just kept working it. But I still was having trouble finding photo reference. And you can't give up. And I found a solution. I'll freely admit, I just stumbled across it. It was in a documentary from 1971 about the shootings, just a half-hour documentary. I'd never seen it before. And I was like, all right, I'll watch this. And I started watching it, and there's the narrator in the front, and he's standing on Water Street. And there it is. And there's the signs and there's the facades. And I was just like, oh, thank you, Jesus. And, stuff like this, it's just kind of a mid-century mod, marvel. I mean, you can't conjure up a sign like that. I mean, and so I was really happy to have that stuff and was just able to fold it all into just this little panel drawing, which took like a month to research. Whoops, let's go onward here. So let me talk a little bit again about paranoia, because this has kind of a New York element to it, which, since I'm talking to Mocha, I thought that'd be nice. Always go local if you can. As I said, 1970 was the year of paranoia. It was all of these forces, these political forces that have been playing out came to a head in 1970. And at the vanguard of it was a group called the Weathermen. And the Weathermen were the extreme radical left, violently radical left of SDS, which was the Students for a Democratic Society, which was the largest anti-war student group in the country with over 100,000 members. They're the ones that organized all the protests and the marches on campuses and in college towns, and according to the government, organized also all the torchings of the ROTC buildings. And the Weathermen were their far left radical fringe, who somehow, through a coup in 1969, took over SDS and destroyed it within 6 months, and then became infamous terrorists for the next few years. And the government absolutely flipped out about the Weathermen. Now, this is a guy named Terry Robbins, and he's a kid from Queens who somehow found his way to Ohio, became an English major, then dropped out, joined SDS in Cleveland, and then helped found the SDS chapter at Kent State in 1968. So the feds he was also one of the founders of the Weathermen, and he was their most violent leader. Now, the feds, of course, knew this. And even though they couldn't find the Weathermen because they were all underground, eluding capture, and the feds had hundreds of agents looking for these people. But they knew he had been at Kent, which kind of raised the paranoia about Kent. And this filtered right down to local government, local police chief in Kent. And so Kent became thought of by the feds as this radical hotbed. Really, it was anything but. It was actually kind of a conservative student body. This was small town Ohio. I mean, this was not a radical place. It had some radical students, to be sure, but I mean, it was not a radical college. But in their minds it was, which of course set the stage for tragedy. This is how Terry Robbins wound up. This is in Greenwich Village. This is on West 11th Street, about halfway between Union Square and Washington Square. Robbins and the New York Weathermen Collective, because in 1970, the Weathermen all went underground to continue they declared war against the US. They went underground, and they were hoping they were sort of like the Boogaloo Boys of the day, except they were more organized, more centrally controlled. They wanted to start revolution. And so they hoped that by, causing as much of a mess as they could, that they would spark the masses to rise up and, like Cuba, and take over the country and blah, blah, blah. They actually believed that this was a possibility in America. So in 1970, they decided to embark on a bombing campaign. And Robbins was building bombs in the basement of this safe house in the village. He was an English major, didn't know what he was doing, and he blew up the whole building. Obliterated himself, killed 2 other Weathermen who were in the building. 2 others crawled out of the rubble and staggered away. And immediately what this did, and this happened just 2 months before May 4, this sent the intelligence agencies in this country, CIA, FBI, Justice Department, you name it, into an absolute panic. And suddenly they started seeing, it was sort of what happened after 9/11 in a lot of ways. Suddenly they started seeing Weathermen behind every bush, down every alley. It just took the paranoia and the tensions to a fever pitch. And so when Kent State flared up, the overreaction can be traced directly to this. So let's talk a little bit about process. And then I think we can take some questions, right, Steve, after that? No questions so far? You were going to interject.
I have a few, but maybe I'll wait till the end.
Okay, up to you.
And again, if anyone has questions, feel free to keep putting them in the chat and I'll collect them.
So process. I started with a script, which I don't always do, but I also did a script for my friend Dahmer. So maybe it's just kind of, if I'm doing a reality-based book, I do a script. I don't know. The fiction books I've done, I haven't done a script. But it's a way to just for me to organize thoughts. Like I said, I had so much research, and one of the things I learned at journalism school was very effectively how to organize notes. So I'm working from the very beginning. I'm like building chapters and keeping things straight, because organization is the most important thing, especially with a complex story like this. Not complex in terms of sweep, but also complex in terms of 5 different narratives that I had to get right. From there, it's thumbnails, and I know there's some people that do like a series of thumbnails getting ever tighter. I come from newspapers originally, so my opinion on tight thumbnails is screw that. I just like to do a rough just to get my thoughts together, get the dialogue down, and that's enough for me. And then I take it right to pencil, and this is where I really figure things out, especially visually. This is where I pour in all that visual research I've done. And so, when you get that bottom panel there with the cars and the houses, well, that's Sandy Scheuer walking along her street. That's actually her street. That's what it looks like. I went down and did some drawing. I did a lot of drawing. You can, just taking reference photos, doing sketches, that kind of stuff. But you can see from the thumbnail, I mean, when you look at it, it's pretty damn close. So I see these things pretty clearly in thumbnail form, and I've always been kind of pretty expressionistic, so I like that immediacy of getting, from thumbnail to solid art as quickly as I can, because I think it gives whatever life my work has in it, my drawing has in it, that's where it comes from. At least that's my belief. I don't know if that's true or not. And from there, using a light tablet, fresh piece of paper, I do the just so I don't have to erase. I do the inks using brush pens and microns, mostly Sharpie markers. Nothing too complicated. I could. I mean, I don't use a Cintiq. I just like the physical act of drawing. I like the feeling of pens scraping across paper. It's just something that pleases me. I mean, it's not that I'm a Luddite, it's just what I enjoy. And it also gives me an original to sell. So, it works out. Believe me, it works out well in the end. And at that point, I scan it in. This is when the work becomes digital, after the inks go on. I scan it in, add the type, and then add the tones or the color, if I'm going to do color, with an Apple Pencil and an iPad Pro. And that's really, it's a pretty quick 4-step process. Of course, whoops. Of course, this is a big ass book, so you're talking 250 pages of art and copy. So, and they're big pages, so it was a lot of drawing. Now, this is the 2-page spread. Obviously, you always like to think in terms of the spread, how the narrative flows from page to page across that, because when you open that book, that's the first thing you see is those 2 pages together. So this is the thumbnail. Here's the pencil. Again, I know this is going to be a night scene, but I'm not filling in everything. You can see that it's pretty. That's real. These 2 pages are really accurate. Very little changed. And then you add the tones, and that's really when it comes all together. There's some really great dramatic lighting in this, especially on Saturday night when the ROTC building went up, because you got that blazing fire. I mean, the fire was like 300 feet high. I mean, the ROTC building was an old Army field hospital from World War II, so it went up like a match. It was also full of ammo, which nobody knew, so it really went up. But it gave me the chance to do some really fun lighting, which I haven't had really an opportunity to do. It's a real drawing challenge. This is stuff I've never drawn before, big crowd scenes like that. That's new to me. Military scenes, military equipment, that's all new to me. You just kind of got to close your eyes and leap into the void when it comes. I did what I had to do to tell this story. I knew it was going to be a challenge. It was, but there was nothing here that really kicked the crap out of me. I mean, I was pretty spent by the time I finished this book, but there was nothing that I attempted to draw that I think I just abjectly failed at. Now here's the iconic photo, Marianne Vecchio screaming over the body of Jeff Miller, taken by a student photographer named John Philo, who won the Pulitzer Prize for this photo. It's probably one of the most famous news photos easily ever. I'm certainly top 50. So how would I depict this moment? I mean, it's an important moment, but when I've seen stuff before, sometimes in comics, sometimes in film, where they like reenact it, you know, right in perfectly, that always strikes me as really lame. It's stiff, it's contrived, it just doesn't work. So I didn't want to do that, but I was having trouble figuring out how to do it. This is the thumbnail, and I wasn't really happy with it. But you know, I just said, all right, that'll do for now, and moved on. So this is a rare case of when I figured it out, not in the thumbnail form, but actually on the page as I was penciling. And I did a couple versions before I finally hit on something. This is a 3-page spread. I hope everyone can see that. Get this thing all the way across. Now that's as good as I can make it. So what I did with my big idea was that, like, all right, what can comics bring to this scene that no other art form can do, no other storytelling form can do? Well, one that leaps to mind is sound, the visual depiction of sound. Sound is a visual element that is unique to comics. And I thought, well, maybe I can do something with that. And so I focused not on Marianne and Jeff, but rather on the screen, the sound of the screen. And this came from talking to people who were there, talking to people who were in that parking lot when those shots were fired. And what a lot of them described to me was, you know, before the shooting, it was just noise everywhere, people yelling, screaming, the guard, you know, trumping by. And then that horrible fusillade. And, you know, just, I mean, the sound of the bullets just being fired. And then when it stopped, there was just this heavy, heavy silence. No birds, no yelling, nothing, just silence. And that sound of that silence, and then the screams started, and then they were just everywhere. And what people, they all described that same, it stuck with them, even to today. And when they started to describe it, I mean, more than one of them started to break down. So, I mean, it's really stuck with them. And I thought, all right, I got to try to capture that somehow. So that's what I was doing here with these screams. And I start on the previous page. You see at the bottom panel of the previous page. And then the scream carries right across the spread, following the reader's eye as you would read the page to the top of the right-hand page, the right page, and then the narrative flows down. And I just thought that that would be a unique way to tell it. And I think it came together pretty well. And that is really, I've talked faster than I probably should have, but that's,
No, that's all right.
I think we have some time for questions.
Sure. Okay, just give me one moment.
Share.
Okay. All right, so I have some questions, and again, if anyone still wants to ask, you have time. I'm going to read through some. If they're redundant, maybe you can elaborate further.
Well, so I'm redundant too, so that's fine.
Matthew says, thank you for sharing your process. The intertwining of characters feels like a fascinating challenge as a writer and artist. Literally, how did you do that? Did you have to draw out a map of everything, work through one character at a time, and then collage it together? Would love to hear more.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to remember that exactly. I think it came together fairly organically, because with each scene, you know, I knew the scenes. I mean, I had plotted those out. And with each scene, I went, okay, who was present at this scene? And then I would find a character, you know, the character, I refer to them as characters. I don't mean that to be demeaning. I mean, they were real people, but we'll just call them characters for this exercise. And then I would figure out what they were doing and how they were moving. So, you know, it was more based on the scene, the chronology of the scenes themselves, and then figuring out who was where. And then I'd figure out, okay, I know that this, say, Bill was here in the Water Street riot. Well, where were the others? And so then I would go and find out what they were doing and work that into the narrative as well. So that's really how the process went as I went along. And it seemed to work. I mean, I lucked out, I think. I wasn't sure that this was going to be the case, and I'm not sure how I would have handled it if it wasn't. But I lucked out that one of those 5 characters was present at every single event that happened over the course of those 4 days.
Wow.
Starting with, the guard in my hometown, my guardsman was there. So, I mean, I was able to keep that progression going. And I've never tried anything that complicated before. Like usually it's just 1 character or 2 max that I base a narrative around. But it seemed to have worked out. I don't know. I think I just lucked out.
Okay. Another question is, a lot of your, or some of your other work is autobiographical. Now, you were 10 years old at the time. Does your memory of the event, did it work its way into how you went about telling the story? Is there something specific to, do you remember this happening when you were a kid?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. There were a lot of older brothers and sisters in my hometown that went to Kent because it was this big university, the nearest big university to my hometown. So a lot of kids went there. Yeah, I remember it unfold. I was also a paper boy. So I delivered the daily paper, and I remember that headline, 4 dead. So yeah, it had a big effect. I mean, it was all, especially in Ohio. I mean, the whole state on May 4th just froze in disbelief. I think more than anywhere else, obviously. And it's part of our DNA here. I mean, it's still a part of society here. So yeah, I remember it well. How did it affect my story? I tried to keep an open mind because I went into this story. I mean, I followed this story for a long time, over the years, over the decades, really. And it's just always been an interest of mine. So I, had a fairly clear idea of what happened, but you have to be able to leave yourself room to be surprised. And, you can't be so focused on telling a story that you think is in your head that you don't explore other avenues. I mean, that's kind of basic journalism. So I did leave that out.
All right. Bob says, I just finished the book yesterday and I loved it. You did a great job. I learned a lot. One of the things that blew me away was the aftermath, the reaction from the government, the establishment, the construction workers, etc. So many people had such bad opinions of the kids. Did that surprise you? Also, you mentioned original art. Are you selling those pages from
Not yet. Actually, all those pages are sitting in this
I
guy's
am.
office.
So if someone wants to make an offer, we could.
Yeah, the aftermath is really depressing, and I don't get into it a lot because that's like a completely different story. The aftermath went on for 10 years. What you need to know is that nobody answered for the shootings. No one. A handful of guardsmen were indicted. The case was thrown out of court because it was kind of a manipulation by Nixon. Where's I going with that? Oh, in New York, I mean, the big impact was the Hard Hat Riot of 1970, which was, the moment that the white working class went from being conservative Democrats to being full-blown Republicans.
Right.
And they brawled in front of City Hall and smashed their way in and beat everybody up, and mainly because the mayor, was that Lindsay at the time, right? Lowered the flag on the flagpole to honor Jeff Miller, who was a New Yorker. He's from Long Island. And the hard hats were outraged by this, the hard hat union. So they busted in, and then they broke into Pace University and just beat up random students. I mean, it was really horrible. That's a direct result of what happened at Kent State. So, the rebuttal was immediate, and it was the same kind of shit we're seeing playing out now, you know. I mean, we're just repeating things constantly. And the big, you know, the torture for me was over the course of the summer, you know, the book was supposed to come out, as I said, in May 2020, and then we put it on hold until fall just to give ourselves a chance. You know, maybe this thing will pass and things will open up a little more. That was a false hope. But I just kind of sat there in horror and watched then the BLM protests fire up and all the you know, the big police riots that happened because of that and the fires and everything. And I just like, my God, here we are again. And so it's, you know, I always felt this book would be relevant. I didn't think it was going to be this relevant, but here we are.
Yeah.
I think it's a miracle we didn't have another Kent State, honestly. I was expecting it. I had given up hope.
Right.
And we didn't. And I think that is the lasting impact of Kent State, is that those, you know, the law enforcement knows what happens if you open fire on a crowd. I mean, nobody wants to live through that again.
Another question I have is, this is a very substantial book. How long from research to writing to drawing did it take to complete everything?
Well, yeah, it was 2 years of research. And keeping in mind that it had always been kind of a hobby of mine, so I've read a lot about it over the years. But yeah, it was 2 years of solid research and interviews, doing nothing else, just research and collecting visual reference and that kind of stuff, and wrapping my head around the narrative. And then it took 2 solid years to draw. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it is. It is a substantial book. I could have really used another year to do it. I promised myself I wasn't going to give myself a hard deadline again, and God damn it if I didn't do it. So it was tough. Yeah, I was pretty exhausted by the end of it.
Okay. Oh, so your style has changed a lot from doing comic strips to books and books like this. Is that intentional, or is it dictated by changing the format, or just your evolution over time?
It's all of those things, I think.
Right.
Yeah, my stuff, I mean, I was really super experimental, like back in the 90s. And you know, I mean, the artwork in a comic strip has a different function than the artwork in a graphic novel, because you're not really telling narrative in a comic strip. You know, you're going from panel to panel, you're delivering a joke, and then it's a walk off.
Right.
So, especially with a free newspaper, which is exclusively what I work for, those free weeklies you used to trip over every time you walked into a coffee shop or a cafe. You know, you're flipping through those papers, and the artwork is there to like grab your attention. So it's a different kind of function. And I mean, if you buy a book, you've already bought the book. I don't have to grab your attention. So at that point, it's about telling a story in a clear way. And yeah, my big transition there was, you know, I was kind of winding down the comic strip, and my first short stories with longer form were still in that style, and I wasn't happy with it. And I knew I needed to get more nuanced. I needed to get more detailed and make it a little more, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think now. But and that really came through with my first book, which was called Punk Rock and Trailer Parks. And it was just sitting down and telling a story. It's like, oh yeah, this is how you do this. This is how this goes together. This is working nicely. And I just kept going from there. But I've always been a really restless creator stylistically. I mean, when I look at my body of work from when I first got out of college to now, I mean, it looks like there's like 4 different artists. It's just, you know, it's just this is the way it is.
I guess that's a good thing, right? You want to have progressed, right?
Maybe I just wasn't happy, you know, and my books kind of all look the same. I mean, I think they're getting more refined, but they all look like they're done by the same guy.
Right.
So obviously I found what I was looking for, even if I didn't know what I was looking for.
Okay. Okay. So I have a question that I may have lost the context to, but it says, Daniel asked, so what surprised you? Maybe
Oh,
this
by Kent
is
State?
in the book. Yeah.
Um, just kind of these sweeping incompetence from literally the top to the smallest official. That was a big surprise. There's a couple revelations in the book that nobody else has, and I don't really want to give those away, because you're gonna have to read the book to get those. Uh, but those were a surprise, and those came through interviews and talking to people who really hadn't talked before. It's like, oh yeah, I know this. Here's, these two people were doing this. I'm like, really? So, I mean, there's some revelations in the book that other people don't have. So, those are the fun surprises.
Right.
Um, yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have no other questions, but I'll give everyone a minute. A question I just like to ask every artist that I talk to is, who are some of your comic inspirations, and are there some non-comic inspirations? It's usually common amongst comic artists that there's like movies that influence them to add sort of a cinematic quality.
Oh, movies.
Mhm.
Yeah. I'm a big Coen Brothers fan.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I love the way they tell stories and the characters that they create. And I like that they move from genre to genre. They'll do something serious, then they'll do The Big Lebowski, and then they'll
Yeah.
do, No Country for Old Men, and they'll just
Right.
keep going on and on and on. I like that. So they're kind of an inspiration to me. Comics, I've had, well, like I said, I've had different parts of my career. For my comic strip, I mean, Linda Barry was a huge inspiration. She really kind of was like blew everybody's mind when she started doing her strip, and all of us in the weekly biz kind of followed her lead. Um, Spain Rodriguez is a big influence as far as longer form storytelling, always has been. And I've always looked to him. You get people saying, like people who don't know anything about comics will say, "Oh, well, he's like, was influenced by Crumb." Actually, I've never really even read a lot of Crumb comics. It was always Spain.
Right.
And if people know comics, they look at it, they can see that. But Corbin is another one. The way he tells stories, he's just such a master of narrative that. So those are the guys I really study closely. But mostly, yeah. I mean, I don't read a lot of comics anymore. I haven't for years. Ever since I started making comics, I stopped
Right.
reading comics. So I'm like a total ignoramus when it comes to modern comics. I see stuff, I go to shows like Mocha and I'll see stuff. I was like, wow, that's great. But I really don't want to spend a lot of time poring over it because, I try to keep my brain clear. So
Yeah.
whatever I produce is, may or may not suck, but it's all me.
Oh, well, I just got a bunch of questions coming through. Okay, so Lauren says, which is a great question, is there a specific daily ritual that keeps you going discipline wise?
When I'm working on a book, yeah, I mean, I do try to, I like, I try to get started by 10 a.m. and I have quotas. Like when I'm working on Kent State, I divide it up. I figure out what my deadline is, and I divide up how many pages do I got to produce a day, how many pages of pencils, how many pages of inks.
Wow.
So I have to produce a day to hit this deadline comfortably. And yeah, if I don't meet that quota, I keep drawing until I do. I mean, it's kind of grueling. Um, right now I'm just kind of, I'm just trying to bang out ideas. So it's a lot of staring at walls and, just try to get in a couple hours good work and then take a break. Taking breaks is important. Go for a walk, just trying to clear your head,
Right.
see what comes to you. So but it varies. There's a big difference between I'm working on a book and when I'm working on ideas. There's a big difference between, kind of the work day.
Sure. Yeah. Bob has a question. What kind of reaction has there been to the book so far? Has it brought about like a resurgence in interest to the history of the shooting?
um, yeah, I mean, the reaction has been fabulous. Surprisingly, it was really great in Europe. I mean, it just went
Hmm.
bonkers in Europe. I
What do you
didn't,
think that is?
I don't know. I wondered if, well, I mean, obviously, I mean, for the French, I mean, they've got, first of all, the French love a great protest. I mean, they always have. And, in France, leading up to when the book was going to be released, I mean, they had the Gilets Jaunes protests that were going on all over the place. So there were millions in the streets. In fact, the last time I was in France, I got tear gassed in a train station.
Wow.
Because there was a march outside and the cops just decided to break it up. So it really resonated with them. I don't know why, but I thought there would be I thought there would be more of a reactionary rebuttal, but that hasn't been the case. Maybe I don't understand. I don't know why. Maybe because they don't read comics. I don't know. But I was expecting that, and it didn't materialize. Or maybe I just told the story well, and there's not really much they can scream about.
All right. Then Teresa asked, so what are you doing now, or looking forward to exploring?
Well, yeah, I'm kicking around ideas right now. I've got a couple that I'm trying to boil down and see what emerges to the fore. I mean, that's basically it. I managed to squeeze out a book like every 4 or 5 years, so that's pretty much all I can do. I mean, I don't really have to. I don't feel like this incredible need to be monstrously prolific anymore. I did that for years. I mean, I used to do a weekly comic strip, so I've done like 3,000 of those, and doing all this stuff for years and years. And now I can kind of take my time and do something that I really like. Whatever time I have left, I'll squeeze out a couple more books, and that'll be great.
All right. Okay, I'm all out of questions. If anyone wants to say something, now would be a good time. But we hit about an hour and 5 minutes, so I think we reached our threshold.
Limit.
Yeah.
Let's cut this asshole off.
All right. Well, if no one has any other questions, Derf, I just want to thank you for spending the time hanging out with us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I mean, I wish I could be, I wish we could be there in Mocha and having fun, but.
And then keep tabs. I will keep everyone posted as to when we have the Kent exhibit at the Society. Hopefully we'll see how the summer goes, and we'll plan for something in the fall going
We'll
forward.
see you in 2035.
All right. Well, thank you, and thank everyone for attending.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good one. Oh. Thank you. Everyone in the chat saying thank you. All right.
All right.
Have a good one.